Yep, that's good.
I wondered why they tore that farm out. I knew they left the barn.
Historical. It's not on. Hello. There we go. I just have to talk into it. Um, I'd like to take a moment to welcome you all here. And as always, there's refreshments over in the back corner and coffee. So please enjoy. Um, First of all, I'd like to announce that our next program is going to be um, The Crafts of Hand Hewing, and it's by Steve Smith, who's a Cumberland resident, and he's the owner of Renaissance Timber. So that should be a very interesting program. Um, I also would like to announce that on October 30th is going to be our annual meeting, and this is when we're going to be electing new directors. And who we have stepping down would be Brian Jensen, Judy Gagnon, and Judy Porter. And who's going to be running is Mike Kemna, is currently director, but he's running a second term. Kathy Allen McDonald, Peter Guaranati, and Michael Buchelt. So if you could all come to that meeting, it's going to be at Valhalla, and it's at 6 p.m. All right, now I'd like to take a moment to introduce Steve Moriarty, and he's going to be doing a lovely program for us on Monroe Comes to Maine. I think most of you know Steve, but for those of you who don't, I lost my cheetah note. Anyways, he's been a member of the Historical Society for many years. He's been on the town council. He's been working on the state level for 20-something years.
Oh, no, 7.5.
Oh, 7.5. Town council is 20.
Yeah, 21.
Okay, town council. Sorry about that. I got my numbers reversed. But anyways, welcome.
Okay, Linda, thank you so much, and welcome everybody tonight. I'm Steve Moriarty. I'm currently the chair of the Cumberland Historical Society, and this is one of our monthly series of lectures that we do throughout most of the year. And as Linda indicated, we've got a couple more programs, or at least one more program coming up before we kind of take the winter off. So I want to begin by thanking two people who gave me a lot of assistance in putting the slide presentation together. I want to thank Devin Galvin, who works here in the Cumberland Rec Department, and also the town's Director of Communications, Whitney Hankin. I'd never put a PowerPoint together personally, so they knew what to do and helped me out a lot. So as you can see, we're going to be talking about a visit by President James Monroe to Maine. A year ago, I read this book, which was published in 2020. It's a biography of Monroe, the latest one, I'm sure. And in reading the book, I learned, among other things, for the first time, that Monroe had come to Maine. I had not heard of that visit before and didn't know anything about it or when it had happened. And at the time, I thought, well, that might be an interesting subject for one of our fairly brief lectures, and decided to run with it. Now, before I get into the heart of the matter, for those of you who may be sticklers, I want to point out that when Monroe came here, he was in fact president. However, Maine was not yet a state. We were to become a state in less than 3 years after his visit, so I don't want to mislead anybody. He came here, we were the District of Maine and not the state of Maine. And for those of you who may be wondering, well, who was the first president who came to Maine after statehood? And I'll share that with you at the end of my program. That's a way of keeping you all here in anticipation of knowing that fact. So this is the opening piece, and the portrait of Monroe that you see there is probably the best known one of all. It's by Gilbert Stuart. It's thought to have been done between 1820 and 1822, right in the heart of Monroe's presidency. And as you can see from the dates, he served 2 consecutive terms from 1817 to 1825. He was our 5th president and was the last president who counts as having been a founding father of the country. So a little bit about Monroe himself before we get into his northeastern tour. He was a native of Virginia, born in Westmoreland County, which is that part of Virginia which is adjacent to the lower Potomac, just as it enters Chesapeake Bay. I'm not sure how long he lived in that particular area. He was born on his parents' farm, but at some point before too much time had passed, he moved further inland toward the area of Charlottesville, and considered that area to be his home. He was of Scottish and Welsh descent. Was the oldest of 5 children. Unfortunately, as was common at that time, his parents died when he was at a very young age of 16. But fortunately, he had an uncle who himself was childless and stepped into the picture and helped care for Monroe and his several brothers and sisters. At his uncle's urging, James attended William and Mary College from 1774 to 76. That means he was... Sorry, typo, 1870, 1758. 1758. Yeah. My bad. I'll take full responsibility for that. So anyway, he attended college from 74 to 76. When he was 16 to 18 years old, he didn't actually graduate from William and Mary, as you'll see. In 1776, of course, the Revolutionary War was underway, and that drew him away. Oops, wrong direction. I'm going to pass that for a minute. Monroe saw a great deal of service in the Revolutionary War. He, at the age of 18, joined the Continental Army, commanded by General Washington. He was a lieutenant in the 3rd Virginia Regiment and shipped out, as it were, to New York State, where most of the action was taking place in 1777. Saw action in combat initially at the Battle of Harlem Heights, which took place in what is now New York City. Our Continental Army did not have much success in the New York and Upper New Jersey area. It was not really a good year for General Washington's forces. Monroe continued to serve as a lieutenant, and a critical point in his life and in the fortunes of the war itself occurred in late December of 76. On that night, as a result of much planning and much advanced work and so forth, General Washington planned a very dramatic strategic maneuver. He led his army after nightfall on Christmas Day across the ice-choked Delaware River to attack the Hessian mercenary forces in the town or city of Trenton, New Jersey, and led a surprise attack early in the morning of December 26. It was very successful. It was not a big battle as these things went, but we captured about 900 Hessian prisoners. And it was enormous morale booster for Washington's army and for the Revolutionary War effort itself, having suffered so many reverses in the New York area. A really tremendous success, and came at just about the right time. Let me flash back and show you a portrait that you probably recognize. This was painted in 1851 by Emanuel Leutze, who was a German-American artist. It now hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and of course it shows Washington crossing the Delaware, something of which I'm sure you're familiar. There's a little bit of artistic license in the portrait, in that it appears to be daylight. It had to be for painting purposes, otherwise it would have been just a sheet of black. But in fact, the crossing was made in the middle of the night. Now, what you may not know is that of course, Washington is central to the portrait. What you may not know is that the figure directly behind Washington and holding the American flag is Monroe, according to the artist who painted the painting. And there are others that could be identified as well. Now, I'm not sure that Monroe crossed the river in the same boat as Washington. I suspect probably not, because he wasn't on Washington's staff or anything of that nature. He would likely have been with his own regiment, the 3rd Virginia. However, the artist clearly wanted to bring Monroe into the picture, so to speak, and I think the painting shows the high level of regard in which Monroe was held in the mid-1850s by Americans, even though Monroe at that point had been dead for 20 years. So this shows the conditions under which Washington's army crossed the river, and on the following morning, Monroe led a charge against the entrenched Hessian forces. Whoop, back just a bit. And as he did so, he was severely wounded in the left shoulder by a musket ball. The wound severed an artery. Fortunately, there was a physician on hand and was able to clamp the artery shut, which very likely saved his life. And given the state of medicine at the time, it's remarkable that he survived at all, but he did, and in relatively good health for the rest of his life. And as far as I know, had normal arm and shoulder motion and movement and so forth, but he carried that musket ball in his shoulder for as long as he lived. This painting, which you may not know, or may not have seen before, is titled The Capture of the Hessians at Trenton, December 26, 1776. The artist is John Trumbull. The slide says the date of the painting is unknown, but I did some more digging and learned that it was done in 1828. It now hangs at the Yale University Art Museum. Now I'm going to use the yardstick I brought with me as a pointer to show you a feature that you may not be able to discern from where you sit. What we did in coming up with this slide was to enlarge the best internet duplicate of the painting that we could find, and in doing so, some of the figures became blurred. So you have to almost take me at my word when I tell you that there is a figure in this portion of the painting. There's the head, the right upper arm, the right forearm. The person is on the ground and leaning on his left arm for support, and you can actually barely make out his left hand grasping his left shoulder, and it's quite bloody. And that figure is Monroe. And he's there because he played a very important role in the battle, and I think the artist quite correctly felt that he deserved recognition and attention for his bravery and for nearly having sacrificed his life. As a result of his heroic actions at Trenton, Washington gave Monroe a battlefield promotion to the rank of captain, which he carried from that point forward. After Trenton, he saw action at the battles of Brandywine and Monmouth. He was with the Continental Army at Valley Forge during the infamous winter of 1777 to 78. In the fall, in 1777, he did ultimately leave the Continental Army with the rank of major and took over as the commander of the Virginia Militia and held the rank of colonel. He held that rank through the end of the war, and specifically through the time of the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, which for all intents and purposes marked the successful conclusion of the Revolutionary War, and then stepped down as the commander of the militia. We then get into the early stages of his political career. And if the phrase Mr. Resume comes to mind, it certainly fits Monroe and his life as a young man and into his middle ages. Right after the Revolution, he began to study law under Thomas Jefferson, and that's largely how lawyers learned their trade at the time, by working with senior attorneys who taught them and allowed them to go with them and learn directly from them. I don't know, well, I think he was admitted to the bar in Virginia in 1783. I don't know if he had a law degree as such, but I don't think that was required at the time. So in 1783, he became an attorney, but then right about that time, he also became a member of the Congress of Confederation. So if you think back to high school history, you'll recall that in the 1780s, the form of government that we had devised for ourselves following the Revolution was called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles were the governing instrument, and they created a somewhat representative Congress, and Monroe was a member for 3 years representing Virginia. He then, probably for financial reasons, which plagued him all of his life, decided that he couldn't continue in that position and opened up a law practice in Fredericksburg from 86 to about 89. In the meantime, of course, the U.S. Constitution was drafted, was ratified by a sufficient number of the states, and went into effect in 1789. And right from the very beginning, Monroe was elected a U.S. Senator, one of the two from the state of Virginia. Philadelphia was the acting capital at the time, and he served there for 4 years. He was very close with Washington, dating back, of course, to the Trenton experience and Monroe's service in the Continental Army. So he was appointed by Washington to serve as minister to France for the period 1794 to 96, and ultimately came home right at the very end of Washington's second term of office at the end of 1796. And soon afterward, after another attempt at practicing law, by the way, which was no more successful than the first, but he did it all the same, he became governor of Virginia and served for about 3 years. And at this point, Jefferson had become president, and they were both good friends. In fact, when Monroe left the area in which he was born, he settled in the vicinity of Charlottesville and had his home in that community. His property was adjacent to Monticello, the home of Jefferson, and they were very, very close politically and otherwise, had a good friendship. So Jefferson appointed Monroe as minister to the United Kingdom. So he served 2 diplomatic tours of duty in Europe in the very early years of our existence as a country. And these were not easy years. Yes, the Revolution was over, but Britain and France were constantly at war with each other. Britain wasn't too pleased with the outcome of the Revolutionary War, and some of the activities, particularly at sea, and involving the impressment of seamen and so forth, tensions were building between the U.S. and Britain, and Monroe was in the thick of it, trying to keep the peace as he served as minister. He came back to the country after Jefferson had left the presidency, served once again as governor of Virginia briefly, and then his other very good friend from the greater Charlottesville area, James Madison, was president, and he appointed Monroe as Secretary of State. That was seen at the time as kind of a stepping stone to the presidency, a very, very important position, and Monroe served in that capacity for most of the Madison presidency. During a short period of time, 1814 to 1815, he simultaneously served as Secretary of War for the U.S., having been appointed by Madison to that position. Recall that this was during the time of the War of 1812, and that in 1814 the British had landed in Virginia. They assaulted Washington, burned the Capitol, the White House, and so forth, and we were desperately in need of a man with military experience who could take over from that disaster and lead the country forward insofar as the conflict was concerned. And so he served through the end, served as Secretary of War through the end of the War of 1812, and then following the Treaty of Ghent and the Battle of New Orleans and so forth, he stepped down but stayed on as Secretary of State. So we come then to the end of Madison's second consecutive term, and in 1816, or I should say 1816 was a presidential election year. And so Monroe ran as a member of what was then known as the Democratic Republican Party. It bore no resemblance to either of the two major parties today. It really wasn't a combination of two parties, but rather a single party with a hyphenated name. The other party at the time was the Federalist Party, and it was on its last legs. The last Federalist candidate for the presidency was a man from New York named Rufus King. Monroe easily defeated him in the election and was sworn in as president on March 4, 1817. This is a sketch of Monroe's first inauguration, and there's a couple of noteworthy things about it. First of all, Monroe was the first president to be inaugurated outdoors, and I think he established a tradition. Virtually all of our inaugurations, in good and bad weather, have been held outdoors ever since. But it wasn't, it was a decision of necessity rather than a genuine desire to be outside, as you might gather from the background of the sketch. And what you see there are the ruins of the U.S. Capitol, which was then being restored and rebuilt, but it obviously wasn't complete, and it would not have provoked, that part of it that remained standing would not have been an adequate facility for an event as large as an inauguration, and may not have been able to hold the number of people who attended. So again, this is March 4, 1817. The oath is being administered by Monroe's other good friend, yet another good friend, Chief Justice John Marshall from the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, this is a rather small slide with just a very short excerpt from a letter that Monroe wrote to Jefferson soon after he became president. They were good. They were correspondents, by the way. Jefferson at this point was too ill to shuttle back and forth to Washington, but he continued to live out his life at Monticello. And among other things, on April 22 of that year, Monroe wrote to Jefferson and said, "There are no very pressing duties here at this time." Now, pause and think about this for a minute. Here's a guy who's just been inaugurated president for the first time, and we know from all the inaugurations that we've personally witnessed that the beginning of a presidential term is a very, very busy period of time. We think of Roosevelt's 100 days and all of those folks who have attempted to emulate that experience. But here's Monroe writing to Jefferson 6 weeks after being sworn in, saying, in effect, "I don't have anything to do here." And so you may wonder why, and I have to digress for a quick second here just to give you the quick answer. At the time of Monroe swearing in, Article 1, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution said that following the even-numbered years in which the members of Congress were elected, as would have happened in November 1816, that Congress would not assemble until 13 months later, in December of the year following the election. Part of the thinking that went into that arrangement when the Constitution was drafted was the difficulty that members of Congress had in wrapping up their affairs back home, making the journey to Washington, and making arrangements for themselves in the new capital. And it seemed at the time to be a good idea. What would happen was that the Congress that was still sitting at the time of the November election would continue to sit in a lame duck session until a president was inaugurated. And then within a matter of days later, they would adjourn and head home for the rest of the year. And that's what happened to Monroe, as it had happened to everybody else at the time as well. Congress left town. The new Congress wasn't due to come in until December of 1817. So there's Monroe in a brand new capital city, no Congress with which to work, Times were quiet, fortunately, and so we found that he just didn't have very much to do. As a final closing point on this rather strange arrangement, it was changed by the 20th Amendment, known as the Lame Duck Amendment, which was ratified in 1933. Really quite a while we lingered with this sort of unworkable arrangement. But under the 20th Amendment, when Congress is elected in November of an election year, it takes office 2 months later at the beginning of January the following year, so that every time a president is inaugurated, the current Congress is in office, they've been sworn, they're there and ready to do business, and you aren't quite created with a situation in which, as a newly minted president, you have nothing to do. Quite the contrary. So, Monroe began to think about the situation, and he knew that we had just come from a very difficult time in the War of 1812, and that we were still a fresh and young nation. The former colonies were still getting used to each other and to living and working with each other and being governed to some extent by each other. And he felt that there was some need to bring the country together. And he conceived of a tour of the Middle Atlantic and northeastern part of the country. The stated purpose of the tour was to inspect facilities such as, let me just advance the slides here. Oops. Expect industry, fortifications, by that I mean military edifices, and to check out military preparedness. Because as much as we were then at peace with Great Britain, you just could never be sure at that era. He also wanted to promote national unity through the office of the presidency, as the president was then and is now the only nationally elected leader. It was intended in concept to be a fairly low-key event. However, it didn't quite work out that way. Monroe was delayed by illness in starting his northeastern tour, but finally left Washington on May 31st, 1817. And I want to just read you a short passage from his biographer, who spoke to the onset of the tour. And he wrote, "Outwardly he clung to his official reason for the tour. Quietly, he saw it as a public opportunity to sow the seeds of unification. Monroe's desire for discretion was quickly dashed just 35 miles into his journey." That's sort of a tongue-in-cheek comment on the part of the author. What he means is people started turning out en masse every place he stopped, every place he passed through. His first major stop, and let me go back and just explain that this is a map of his tour. I have darkened the route in marker to show you where it began and ended. You can see that his first major stop was Baltimore, and he had an enormous, rousing reception in that city. Monroe toured Fort McHenry, which was of course bombarded during the War of 1812, and that's how the Star-Spangled Banner was written, or what it was written about. The turnout was incredibly enthusiastic, and it played out that way everywhere he went. The next major stop was Philadelphia. He stayed there for 10 days and had this tremendous, warm and enthusiastic welcome. He'd spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania, of course, in the war, in the Congress of Confederation. He had a lot of friends still in the greater Philadelphia area, so it was quite natural for him to want to stay there, and he did. and for 10 days. Then moved up through New Jersey to New York City. Once again, just a series of 3 full days of parades, tours, banquets, receptions, official events. It became quite exhausting for him. And but he persevered and went on. And from New York, as you can see, he went up through Connecticut, Central Mass, back down through Rhode Island, and then up to Boston. I should say that before he got into the New England area, he also stopped at Trenton. And here it was some 40 years after he nearly lost his life in that battle. And of all the stops he made in this tour, this was probably the most enthusiastic and heartfelt of all. People remembered him, and he obviously remembered his experience there, was grateful for the care that he received that saved his life. So that was quite an emotional gathering when he stopped at Trenton. In Boston, the turnout was remarkable. According to the author, some 40,000 people are estimated to have packed themselves into Boston Common to hear him speak. He visited Bunker Hill and the USS Constitution, which played a major role in the naval campaign in the War of 1812. He also had a chance to visit with former President John Adams and his wife Abigail at their farm, which was known as Peacefield. Now, just some 20 years earlier, Monroe and the senior Adams were political antagonists. They weren't particularly close at all. But 20 years had passed. At this point, Adams was corresponding with Jefferson regularly, as you may know. They had been political enemies for a while. But the Adamses had particular good reason to be happy with Monroe, because Monroe had just appointed their son, John Q. Adams, to be his Secretary of State. And John Q. served Monroe for the entire duration of his presidency, and as you probably know, succeeded him in the office of the presidency itself. So it was quite a warm and genuine getting together of 2 former political antagonists. And he continued on from Boston, as the chart shows. At this point, the routine of his tour had kind of settled into a pattern. And as his biographer has described, the tour was now routine: pomp, pageantry, and speeches, parades, followed by more speeches, dining, visits to military installations and factories, and even more speeches. But the president realized each town's hospitality was heartfelt, and he responded in kind. So that's how it went, as Monroe went by horse-drawn coach and continued northward into northern New England. He passed through New Hampshire along the coast, ended up at Portsmouth, where he stayed for several days, and then began his tour of Maine. Now, I'll tell you, he was in Maine for only about 2.5 days. So it wasn't as long as some of the other states in which he passed through. You might ask why he bothered to come to as remote a location as Maine at all. There is a book at the Maine Historical Society Library, located behind the Longfellow House on Congress Street in Portland, called A Narrative Tour of Observation During the Summer of 1817. No author's name appears on the book, but the author wrote, "The increase in population in the province of Maine and the consequent augmentation of its importance in the Union had occasioned the construction of many objects which Mr. Monroe deemed worthy of his inspection. And what I think is most critical about that sentence is the reference to the augmentation of Maine's importance in the Union. We weren't yet a state. The people of Maine had not yet voted for statehood, but the wind was blowing in that direction, and it was clear that it was bound to happen sooner or later. It wouldn't take much longer before it did happen. But it was important. I think Monroe sensed what was on the threshold of becoming reality and wanted to make a point of visiting Maine in anticipation of ultimate statehood. So, that's the thing I just read. So on July 15, notice that even back then, prominent people came to Maine in the summertime. He crossed by ferry from Portsmouth to Kittery, and was formally welcomed in Kittery, and there were the customary exchanges of greetings and responses and so forth. And his schedule that day was truly long and exhausting, as you're about to see. His destination was Portland. And it was a bit of a slow road in getting there. From Kittery, he went to York, same sort of speeches and exchange of pleasantries and so forth, welcoming the, responding to the public and getting, thanking the people for turning out. And then in Kennebunk, I found some comments that I thought were useful to share with you. The chair of the welcoming committee, among other things, and of course in the early 1800s, speeches were long and tedious, but I just clipped it to one or two portions here. But the speaker said, "We congratulate you, sir, upon the present peaceful state of our country, and that your administration of the government commences under circumstances so pleasant to yourself and auspicious to them." And so Monroe was really quite moved by the gentleman's comments, and he offered a reply, as he always did. Now, his speeches weren't prepared for him, and each one was not different from the other necessarily. He tended to repeat common themes. But from his remarks in Kennebunk, I selected just a couple of short paragraphs which I think are truly representative of what he said to the gathered Americans when he stopped to greet them or meet them as they came out to see him pass through. And they are particularly poignant and pertinent when we consider the somewhat difficult times in which we currently live. So Monroe said to the people of Kennebunk, "I have thus afforded myself so many opportunities of seeing and feeling how much we are one people, how strongly the ties by which we are united do in fact bind us together, how much we possess in reality a community not only of interest, but of sympathy and affection. The further I advance in my progress, the more I perceive that we are all Americans, that we compose but one family, that our Republican institutions will be supported and perpetuated by the united zeal and patriotism of all." Remarkably appropriate comments for us to hear again today. And again, this was the major theme that he expressed as he traveled throughout the country, that of unification and commonality of interest. So anyway, from Kennebunk, he kept moving northeast, went through Wells, Arundel, Biddeford, and Saco on his way to Portland. Now, one of the ways that you can approach Portland from the south is through Stroudwater, which was then a village in its own right. Today, of course, it's just part of Portland. By the time he got close to Stroudwater, he was way behind schedule. All these various stops had taken a lot of time, and he didn't want to cut anything short or appear to be in a hurry or whatever. So he was a good 2 hours behind schedule as he drew near to Stroudwater. The residents of Stroudwater, knowing that he was coming, had really gone all out to dress up their area for him. There was a bridge over the Fore River in Stroudwater, as there is today, on Outer Congress Street. And the bridge had been decorated by 20 arches, one arch per state in the Union at that time. And the arches were built of evergreen. They were decorated with roses and other forms of vegetation. There was a name for each state of the Union attached to each arch. And as you approached from the south, at the very first arch at the top, there was a much smaller arch. And under the small arch was a live eagle. Don't ask me how they got a hold of that eagle or how they kept it in the arch, but it was there and apparently was not free to go. So, anyway, there was a tremendous turnout in Stroudwater. They were waiting, forever, and then 2 hours later than should have happened, they began to see a cloud of dust in the distance, which was moving ever closer to them. At the Maine Historical Society Museum, there is a scrapbook of newspaper articles compiled by a man named Nathan Clifford. I otherwise don't know anything about him. I don't know, because the volume doesn't say, what period of time the scrapbook covers. And many of the articles don't have dates and don't bear the name of the author. But in this particular scrapbook, there is an article written by an individual who, at the time of Monroe's visit, was a resident of Stroudwater. In fact, he described himself as a 12-year-old boy in July of 1817. And he described what had been done to decorate the bridge and how eager the people were to have Monroe stop, take a look at the bridge and all the preparations they'd made, and to extend his greetings to the people. So as the cloud of dust grew bigger, the cry went up, "The president is coming." And according to the author of the article, this is what transpired. The cavalcade immediately came dashing down the hill, followed by the whole retinue, who drove through the village with lightning speed, leaving the vast assemblage gazing at the proceeding with blank astonishment. Even the eagle neglected to scream. I don't know who, but somebody made the decision that he couldn't afford to stop in Stroudwater. And so he dashed right through, his carriage dashed through, together with the cavalry and those on horseback behind, leaving the people there wondering why they had, in effect, been stood up and feeling a little shortchanged. So Monroe, we'll come back to this in a minute. Just move on. Okay, we'll hold on that one. So Monroe went on to Portland, and there were again the customary greetings and responses. There was a big banquet. There were fireworks. Monroe Hill and the observatory were illuminated. It was quite a scene. Monroe was welcomed in particular by some delegations from some northern communities, Brunswick, Bath, Woolwich, and Wiscasset, who urged him to continue on with his journey. Keep on coming. We'd love to have you visit our towns as well. And Monroe very politely and diplomatically said, you know, I'd love to go as far as Castine, if time allowed. But the further northeast I go, I'm going to have to cut out the planned western portions of my tour and disappoint people out there, so I'm sorry, but I won't be able to go beyond Portland. Sometime that evening, word got to him about the disappointment of the residents of Stroudwater and their perception of how they had been treated. And he realized that on the following day, he was going to have to do something about that. So on the next day, July 16, he did what he promised he would do on the tour and visited some military fortifications. This is a portion of a modern-day map of the Portland waterfront and a portion of South Portland. And I'm going to take my yardstick once again, and you'll readily see that this is part of the Portland waterfront, and this is a part of South Portland where the Southern Maine Community College currently stands out in this area. So Monroe visited two military fortifications. Here on House Island, he toured Fort Scammell, and then also toured Fort Preble, which stood on the grounds now occupied by the community college. And he was quite satisfied with what he saw in terms of military preparedness. And so after having taken that tour of the harbor, he came back into Portland, undoubtedly had a banquet for lunch, and then said, okay, we got to get back to Stroudwater. And so he went back. And the people knew or had been told that he would be coming back, and they were deeply grateful. And he got out of his carriage, and he went onto the bridge, and one by one he inspected each and every arch and all its unique details, and thanked the people profusely for their effort and apologized extensively for the timing problems and the oversight in just rushing through the day before. And the folks in Stroudwater felt really good about it, and that was taken care of. So on his final day in Maine, he was still in Portland. He spent 2 nights in Portland, got up early in the morning, and in effect retraced his route, headed south, stopped in Biddeford for breakfast with a justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and then kept on going to Dover, New Hampshire, where he spent the night. So we're going to go back to the map of the tour. And as you can see, he went through southern New Hampshire, crossed into northern Vermont and upper New York State, traveled by ship on Lake Ontario down to Buffalo, and then from Buffalo over to Detroit, Michigan. Michigan was not yet a state, by the way, and wouldn't become one for another 20 years. And I'm just going to move quickly now. As you can see, he went straight south through central Ohio, and then took a turn toward the east, and came in through western Pennsylvania to Pittsburgh, and then back home to Washington, D.C. This was quite an experience for him. The tour itself lasted 110 days, an amazing amount of time for a president to be away from Washington, regardless of whether Congress is there or not. He traveled just under 3,000 miles and visited over 120 cities, towns, and settlements. It was a remarkable experience for him and a very unifying experience for the country. So much so that Monroe kept doing it. In the following year, 1818, he took a much shorter tour, this one lasting about 3 weeks, through the Chesapeake area. But again, the same purposes: to inspect military fortifications and to sow the seeds of unity and identity as Americans. In the year following that tour, he turned his eyes toward the southeastern United States. And this shows you, not quite as clearly, the route that he took from Washington, straight south, and then over to the west. Circumstances were a little bit different. He still wanted to promote the concept of unity and the identity of Americanism and so forth, but the country was in the middle of a financial panic at the time. And so part of his purpose in making this tour was to reassure people that things would get better and we would come out of it. And he was welcomed as warmly in the Southeast as he had been in the Northeast, particularly so in Charleston, South Carolina. But note that he went more further west on this tour than he had on his first. And this was in July of 1819. And it's one thing to come to northern New England in July. It's another thing to go to the deep south in July. And he became exhausted. His goal, in part, was to be the first president to cross the Mississippi. But by the time he got to Tennessee, his health was so ravaged that he realized he couldn't do it and that he would have to turn back and head home. But he kept on going through Tennessee, spent some time with Andrew Jackson at his home, went up to Kentucky, met briefly with Henry Clay, and then again turned back toward Virginia, stopping at his home in the Charlottesville area, and then back to Washington. He was gone almost exactly 5 months to the day on this southeastern tour, and traveled again by horse and carriage, something that would strain the health of any individual, and he was, by the standards of the time, no longer a young man, but again a very successful venture for him. By the end of 2019, think of it, he had visited the entire eastern seaboard and had ventured into the west, beyond the Appalachians, but short of the Mississippi, something no other president had done, and really did a lot by just his mere presence to bring the country together. So very quickly, I just want to summarize some of the important events of Monroe's 8-year presidency. We're all familiar with the term the Monroe Doctrine. It was something that his administration announced. It forbade any further European colonization of the Western Hemisphere, and in particular prohibited any European recolonization of those countries in South America which had only just very recently won their independence. In turn, it also said that the U.S. would not involve itself in European wars. So it was sort of it was something for everybody in the doctrine. We still pay homage to the Monroe Doctrine. I can't say it's been faithfully followed in the 2 decades since it was promulgated, but it still is an aspect of our diplomacy, and it gets raised every time some foreign power gets a little bit too aggressive or pushy here in the Western Hemisphere. Of particular importance to us here in Maine is the Missouri Compromise of March 1820, which admitted Maine and Missouri as states simultaneously, and which was the sort of the precursor or the first major event in the build-up to the American Civil War, which came about some 40 years later. We acquired Florida by treaty without having to go to war with Spain, which was the prior owner, if you will, of Florida. He established the border between the U.S. and Canada at the 49th parallel from the Great Lakes to the Oregon Territory, which was rather poorly defined at the time. The Oregon Territory consisted of what today are the states of Oregon and Washington plus British Columbia. And it was agreed that it would be jointly occupied and administered by the U.S. and Britain for at least 10 years. And remarkably, it worked out peacefully and successfully. He also established the southern border between Russian Alaska and the Oregon Territory. That was at the 54° 40' latitude mark. And then finally, he entered into a treaty with Great Britain regarding the use of naval forces on the Great Lakes. Smart thing to do, because naval issues had always been a provoking problem for the U.S. and Britain, and were largely responsible for the War of 1812 itself. Monroe's term in office is often referred to as the era of good feeling. That expression was coined by a Boston newspaper during the time that Monroe was in Boston in 1817. And it was, relatively speaking, a politically quiet and peaceful time. When Monroe ran for re-election in 1820, he was unopposed, the last person to run for the presidency without opposition. So he obviously won and went into his second term, and served until March 4, 1825, when John Q. Adams took over. At that point, Monroe returned to his home known as Highland in the Charlottesville area of Virginia. He was a farmer at heart. As I said earlier, he wasn't terribly successful as an attorney, but he loved farming. He wasn't very successful at it as well, but it's still what he did and loved to do, and took his hand at it as best he could in the years that were remaining to him. He was visited in Virginia by President Adams and also by Lafayette, who was on a tour of America in the second half of the 1820s. He traveled to Washington, D.C. at least once, had dinner with President Jackson. That would have been after March 1829. Otherwise spent his time on the farm in Virginia. And the farm, by the way, was a rather modest affair when compared to Jefferson's fairly palatial home, but it served his family well. We moved to September of 1830, and unfortunately his wife Elizabeth, who had had some chronic health problems, passed away and was interred in a family crypt, either on or close to the farm. The loss of his wife was devastating to Monroe, and his family could see it, and they decided he just couldn't live on his own at Highland, that he needed to be elsewhere with family. He had a daughter who was married and lived in New York City, and they had a nice big home in what is now Manhattan. And so he moved to be with them and lived out his days in New York. His health continued to deteriorate. He had tuberculosis and likely heart disease, and ultimately passed away in the summer of 1831. Now, you probably all know the story behind the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. On July 4, 1826, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died within hours of each other. They had both been in failing health for some time. It took a while for news of their almost simultaneous deaths to travel around the country, but when it did, what a coming together that was, and what a remarkable event it was to harken back to Adams and Jefferson's most prolific days and important days as servants of their country. What you may not know and may not have heard before is that exactly 5 years later, on July 4, 1831, Monroe died. So of our first 5 presidents, 3 died on the 4th of July. No other president so far has died on that same date. So Monroe was in New York at the time of his death, and as you can imagine, there was a huge public funeral. It was estimated that some 70,000 people crowded the streets of Manhattan and paid their respects to him as his cortege passed. His casket was placed in the crypt of a church which was either owned or rented by his son-in-law's family, and there he rested. So Monroe had passed away, but he still had one more journey to make. In 1858, which was the 100th anniversary of his birth, the Virginia legislature appropriated enough money to return his remains to his home state. And so his casket was taken from the crypt in New York City, placed on a steamboat, which headed south, and ultimately the destination was Richmond, where he was buried in the Hollywood Cemetery. Now, understand that the Hollywood Cemetery was opened in the 1840s, therefore bore no relationship to the movie industry. And it still is regarded today as one of America's most beautiful cemeteries, and it's still a working cemetery. In other words, people are still being buried there. In the following year, 1859, a tomb was constructed at the point at which Monroe had been interred. And there it is as it looks today. This is a wrought iron structure in the Gothic Revival style. It is in a portion of the Hollywood Cemetery known as President's Circle, because President John Tyler, our 10th president, is also buried in this circular or cul-de-sac area. Soon after the tomb was finished, the locals began referring to it as the birdcage. There was nothing derogatory about that comment. It was just probably whimsical on their part, but the name has stuck, and people still refer to the tomb as the birdcage. It was restored about 10 to 15 years ago and repainted in the original ivory color. In the intervening years, I've seen some sketches. It apparently had been painted a darker color, but now it looks as it did originally. And there's one postscript to the Monroe story. I mentioned earlier that his wife Elizabeth had been interred on the farm or close by it when she died in 1831. In 1903, and I don't know who was responsible for the fundraising and the arrangements, but Mrs. Monroe's casket was removed from the crypt in which she had rested and was brought to the Hollywood Cemetery. And unfortunately, the birdcage had been built just to hold one coffin, so to speak. So Mrs. Monroe and one of the Monroe's daughters is buried just behind or very close to the tomb of her husband. So since 1903, the Monroes have rested together in peace. And in the photo, you can make out some visitors in the background. It's still a popular attraction for those visiting Richmond. So that brings us to the end of this short synopsis of Monroe's presidency and of his northeastern tour, and a little bit about his southeastern tour. I promised you when I began that I would tell you or share with you the identity of the first president to visit Maine after we became a state in 1820. And I'd be glad to entertain any guesses if anybody wants to try. And the person has said Polk, And you're absolutely right. The first sitting president to visit Maine was James K. Polk. Once again, in the summer, they all traveled to Maine in the summer of 1847, some 30 years after Monroe had been here himself. I didn't do a lot of research on Polk's visit. My sense is it was a little bit different in terms of spirit and quality, if you will, than Monroe's trip. This was in the middle of the Mexican War, which was very unpopular in New England and the Northeast in general. It had in fact been started by Polk, but he had been invited by the Maine legislature to come on up and visit, and so he traveled by train from Boston to Portland, and then in Portland he boarded a steamer which went up the coast and then up the Kennebec River to my boyhood hometown of Hollowell, which was at the time a seaport, even though it's well inland. The Kennebec is very tidal at that point. And so we got off the steamboat, went up the extra 2 miles to Augusta, visited the legislature, greeted the numerous people who came to the grounds of the State House to say hello to him, and it was very cordial and everything went well and so forth. And the following day he went back downriver to Gardner, picked up a steamboat and sailed back to Portland. And since Polk's visit, of course, many presidents have visited Maine. I think probably Grant was the next one, and then they become more frequent as you get into the latter part of the 19th century, and certainly in the 20th century, particularly with the senior President Bush. So, if we're going to be very precise about who the first president was who visited Maine as a state, the answer would be Polk rather than Monroe. But given the difficulties of Monroe's journey, given the purposes of his visit and his intent in nation building, I think it's only fair to credit him with being the first president to visit Maine while in office. I'd gladly take any questions that anybody may have. Yes?
I know they sort of rank presidents according to their accomplishments, and it all has to do with when things happen, obviously. But was he considered a great president?
I don't think he falls into the great category as most historians have described it, and there are varying lists. I think in one list that I saw, he was about 12th, so fairly high up the list, and I think that's only fair because there were some major accomplishments during his administration, the key ones that I mentioned earlier, and I think he's definitely worthy of being in that upper level, but he's not up with the Roosevelts, Lincoln, and folks in that category. And it may depend upon the historian in question. Yes?
Was at any time Monroe a slave owner?
Question is, was Monroe a slave owner? His parents owned slaves, and when they died in his 16th year, he became a slave owner. He remained a slave owner for the rest of his life. He did emancipate one slave at the time of his death, one who had cared for him personally and acted not really as a valet, but just a close companion and one who looked after him with particular care and affection. So as a slave owner, he was not unique. To that point, John Adams had been the only president who was not a slave owner, and many of the men who followed Monroe were, in fact, slave owners. Some exceptions, but many were. That's a good question. Yes?
I didn't understand the border with Alaska. Where was that border?
Oh, I don't have a map. But if you think about Alaska, there's this long neck that kind of comes down the western coast, and it borders now British Columbia, I think. I may have my provinces wrong.
Yeah, that's why I was confused because of Canada.
Okay.
What does that have to
Um,
do with the US?
So where's what now?
What does that have to do with the US against Canada?
Well, because British Columbia was not yet a province. It was just part of the Oregon Territory. All of it was kind of unregulated. And it was important for various reasons, to figure out where the property line was, whose property ended where. Russia owned Alaska. The southern limit of its own property was not established, so by treaty, they fixed upon the 5440 line as marking the southernmost part of Russia. And that, I think, and so then British Columbia, when it became a province, they took over and they recognized that same line as the dividing line between the two political entities.
So that's how it is now?
Yeah.
Washington and Canada? They say
No, actually, if you look at I don't have a map of the entire U.S. If you envision the northern border of the U.S., it's kind of a straight line from the Great Lakes over toward the Seattle and Puget Sound area.
Yeah.
Then it dips down so that an island in the Puget Sound
Yeah, I know.
all falls within Canada and not split between two countries. But that, so the treaty that Monroe signed left all of that to be decided later on, and that was done in about the 1840s. I think Daniel Webster was Secretary of State at that time. And so they settled finally on the border between Washington State and everything north of which was Canada, ultimately the province becoming British Columbia. Okay, yes.
Okay, when George Washington commissioned the Portland Headlight, did he physically come to Maine?
Not that I'm aware. I find no indication that he came to Maine.
So he commissioned it, so if he commissioned it, what does that mean?
Well, commission is to authorize it, in effect, which can be done from a desktop elsewhere. You don't have to crack a bottle of champagne to, I guess, commission a lighthouse, and so I don't believe he ever came to Maine. I do know that he came to Portsmouth, so he came very close to Maine, but I'm not aware they ever actually set foot in what is now the state. Anybody? Yes.
I don't have a question, but I was just gonna say that what he said when he was in Kenny Bunkport, it sounded a lot like the woman who's running for president right now.
Well, it sounds like a lot of, yes, it does, but it sounds like a lot of people who are commenting upon our current state of affairs. And so that's, I sort of picked it out for that one reason, to show that this isn't the only time when unity has become a bit tricky. It was in Monroe's era as well, because we were so freshly minted as a country and had been through the trauma of the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and we're still, learning to live with each other as a single country.
I just heard it last night. I recognize it.
Yep, it is something you'll be hearing. Yes.
You mentioned that Monroe owned slaves his entire life. So did he take those slaves with him when he went to New York?
So the question is, did he take the slaves with him when he went to New York? And you mean at the end of his life? Not to my knowledge. Now, the one slave that he emancipated may have come with him because he served as a personal attendant. But as far as I know, the rest of them remained on the family farm at Highland, adjacent to Monticello in Virginia.
The family kept the farm even though he had moved to New York.
Yes, that's right. For some years, and then it passed into private ownership. Yes.
I just have a comment, Steve. As a family genealogist now for visit that Hollywood cemetery.
Oh, really?
And I've been in there for, hundreds of cemeteries, and I was so impressed with the first time I feel it's a beautiful park and garden, as well as a cemetery, and I've been back after that. So if anybody's ever in the Richmond area, it's worth a visit for the history and just the beauty of it. It's a great place.
Well, for those of you at home listening, one of our attendees this evening has told us that she has been to the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, and it has great praise for its beauty and design. And it was not by accident. I think right from the beginning in the 1840s, it was laid out in such a way as to become a real showcase, so to speak. It's about 130 acres big, so it's a big piece of property. I've been to Richmond, but never to the cemetery. Having done this program, having seen the monument, I would like to go there. That's right. Anybody else? Well, thanks very much for coming tonight. Appreciate it. Good to see you all. Where's Linda? Oh, thank you.
Pleasure.
Okay, well, thank you.